Hi, I'm Moe Bergman. This is 508, a show about Worcester.
Also on today's show, Tracy Novick. Hi, Tracy.
Hi, Mike.
And I am Michael Benedetti, and we are back here in the Winslow Street Peace Park. We're talking to city council candidates. We're talking to them about the issues. We're talking to the challengers. This week, Moe Bergman running at large.
Right.
Moe, you are involved in, I would say, a ton of stuff in the city of Worcester, or have been down through the years. What are you doing right now to be active in the community?
Well, I volunteer for Preservation Worcester.
Okay.
So what we do with Preservation Worcester is we try to highlight some of the historic significance of Worcester, some of the properties that have been historically significant, some of the people that have been historically significant, and most importantly, the stories that are historically significant. Worcester has a great history, whether we're talking about the American Revolution, Civil War, or civil rights, on par with any other city in America, including our sister city of Boston down the road.
Yes.
The problem is we don't really respect our historic significance. We kind of look at Boston as the city with all the history, but we have it right here in Worcester. And Preservation Worcester does an awfully good job on trying to get that message out, but we've got a long way to go. I always say that I'd like to consider Worcester to be the type of city that when you're traveling abroad, people ask you where you're from, you no longer say near Boston, you say I'm from Worcester.
That's true. That's true. Are you on any boards and commissions right now?
I had been on numerous boards, and I
Right.
actually weaned off boards to run for city council because I have found that if you're going to do something and you can't give it 110%, you're not being fair to anybody.
Yeah, yeah. And because you've run for city council before,
I ran
right?
2007, came up
Uh-huh.
a little short. It was a good first effort, but nevertheless didn't win. And I'm back again this time. And I'd like to say I'm in it to win it.
I want to. So here's the question I've been asking people who are active in the community, as you certainly are, is why do you want to be on the city council rather than any of the other many ways that people can spend their time in Worcester that don't require hundreds of hours of effort, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of person hours of volunteer effort?
No, it's a great question, but I can tell you that I served 2 terms on the zoning board
Uh-huh.
in 2000, almost 2001, 2008 or 9. There's a lot you can do on boards, but ultimately you can't get as much done as you can being on the council. And if you're somebody who's passionate about improving the city of Worcester, you can only get so far on certain boards. They're great springboards because they teach you a lot about the city. The zoning board, planning board, and other boards are tremendous as far as giving you a good background about what the city of Worcester is all about. But ultimately, you can't get certain levels of things done unless you're on the city council. Quick example, on the zoning board, we need to make lots of changes in the zoning ordinance.
Uh-huh.
As a zoning board member, we can't make those changes. The council can make those changes.
What kind of zoning changes do we
I'll
need
give
to
you an
make?
example. We treat the city of Worcester as if it's instead of being 2013, it's 1900.
Okay.
We tell business owners that you can't open in business zones unless you have parking lots so people can park. The reality is we have a city that's well developed. So as long as we're keeping businesses in the business zones and away from the residential areas, we should allow, for the most part, businesses to open, regardless of whether or not they do or do not have parking. Now, the exception would be businesses that serve liquor, because obviously there are safety issues. But if you're a mom and pop store, you want to open up in a business neighborhood and you don't have sufficient parking, you should be able to open. And that's what progressive cities like New York and Boston and elsewhere do. They say, come, open up, you're either going to make it or not with the limited parking you have, but we're not going to stop you. We prevent people in the city from opening businesses up because we have antiquated zoning laws.
I like this idea. This is one of these subjects. The idea of liberalizing zoning laws is one of these ideas that I'm very excited about and know nothing about. But every time I read an article about it, I'm always like, this sounds great.
Well, no, it's interesting. The city tends to have a lot of archaic laws. Technically, if you have a restaurant or a coffee shop and you play a jukebox or a radio,
Right.
you're doing something illegal in the city of Worcester unless you have a permit from the License Commission to operate a non-live entertainment venue.
Oh, really?
So that is something that the city of Boston puts online and says, give us $50, don't show up for hearing, and we'll give you the license. Worcester makes it so that you want to do it right, and a lot of people don't because it's burdensome. You have to go in front of the License Commission and ask permission, which is something that's really not business friendly.
So you have to have a hearing if you're going to play, over and above whatever ASCAP and other licensing fees.
If you're honest about it, I mean, you go to the supermarkets, they're playing music, and I'm sure they don't ask. But if you're honest about it and want to abide by the law, today in the city of Worcester, you'd have to get a permit to operate, to just tune in your radio and have people at a coffee shop listen to the radio.
That is crazy. Tracy, if you have any questions, you should jump in.
I will do that. You are going to ask about his signs, right? Because this is the sign.
I'm going to
question
ask
is
about the
crucial.
signs. I'm going to ask about the signs near the end of the show.
That's fine.
I normally don't like to talk about horse race stuff on the what I would think of as horse race stuff on the show, but the signs we need to talk about. Here's another question along these lines. Maybe it's a little bit of a zoning question. What do you think about this idea of taking the Midtown Mall by eminent domain?
Well, It's a complicated question. I'm happy to answer this in the limited time we
Sure.
have. I mean, I think the city's going to be careful in what it takes and for what it takes it for. I mean, obviously, the city has legal authority under expanded cases to take property for economic purposes. They probably could take the Midtown Mall if they wanted to, but what's it going to be taken for? That's question number one. Question number two is who's going to pay for the taking? Ultimately, it's the taxpayer, so you better have a pretty good plan on how you're going to spend the taxpayers' money with what you're going to do. And number three, it becomes a very delicate issue as to whose property you're taking and whose you're leaving alone, because if you go downtown, there's lots of properties that you can make the argument the city would be better off if it was developed in a much better way. Having said that, I don't think it serves the city well to have outdated, somewhat non-professional looking buildings. But there's a flip side to all of that, which is that there are a lot of businesses, immigrant owners and new businesses that rent in the Midtown Mall, and somebody has to, ask the question, where are they going to go if they're displaced? And that's a question that I think oftentimes gets overlooked because we don't have enough, of incubator type space, I guess is the word I'm looking for new businesses. Now, granted, it shouldn't be in the heart of downtown across from City Hall, but then again, I'd have a problem displacing business owners who are doing everything right, trying to make a living, and they're not, doing anything wrong, and they're going to ask the question, why are you taking this property away from me? So it's a complicated question. I'm not trying to dodge it, say there's a time and a place for eminent domain taking. I'm not sure the time and the place right now is the Midtown Mall.
Okay, fair enough. Do you think that Worcester is, on the city level, financially sustainable?
I think Worcester is, but I think there's some trends we've got to be concerned about. If you look at the per capita income of the cities and towns of Massachusetts, all 351 of them, Worcester, unfortunately, is getting near the lower tier, and we need to do a better job at maintaining and attracting middle-class folks, because at the end of the day, the rising tide carries all ships. We have to have a solid middle class so that we can afford to help out all classes of people. So I think it's sustainable, but I think we're getting to the point we have to pay particular attention to the changes we have going on economically in the city and try to account for it and plan for the future, because in the future we have a lot of property going off the tax rolls to our nonprofits. We have a lot of property that's being foreclosed. We've got some issues we have to tackle, but yes, I believe it's sustainable.
What about like on the government level? We've had a lot of people candidates coming on this show talking about on pension liabilities and things like
well,
this.
Well, I can talk a little bit about that. It's something you need to do your homework with before you press the panic button on unfunded pension liabilities. Yes, there are unfunded pension liabilities in the city of Worcester, and there are in every major city, and probably less, significant sized cities. The question is, how are they being addressed? And I can say Moody's, as recently as this spring, when they give the bond ratings to the various cities throughout the United States, gave Worcester the top tier, AAA rating, and they actually quoted Worcester's policy towards unfunded pension liabilities, saying that we're taking the right approach to manage that situation well. So we have some issues related to making sure we have enough money in the future, but we also have some policies in place that are making the pension issue less significant as others would like to have people believe. I don't like pressing a panic button unless it's necessary. I think unfunded pension liabilities is something you have to keep an eye on, but I don't think we're at a crisis moment. I don't think it's a top issue that most people want to hear about a city council race. I think you could certainly substitute taxes any day for unfunded pension liabilities. That's something people want to talk about.
Are you in favor of trying to get lower people's taxes in the city?
Well, I don't think it's a question on the residential side of ever lowering them. I think it's a question of not raising them. I think they are what they are. I think you have to balance that with the business owners. I always lean towards the lowest residential rate because I think one of the things that affects both business owners and residential owners the most is the middle class. In other words, if we have a solid middle class, it benefits business owners too because it's more disposable income. But you can't have a solid middle class if you're raising their taxes. So in that delicate balance of where your opinion is on the tax rate, I like last year's solution best, where both sides got together and they worked on a tax rate where the business side and residential side can live with. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to City Council more times than not to set the rate. I actually issued a press release this morning to the newspapers on the issue of why we haven't talked about the class taxification rate before this year's election. I think it's a disservice to the voters, and I think that conversation should happen before the election because I think the voters going to the voting booth should at least have a sense of where the city council stands. And I don't think it's just an issue for this year. I think every 2 years when there's an election, we certainly ought to have a certified assessment so we can have that conversation.
Huh.
Didn't they talk about that? I think 2 years ago that was actually something that people were pushing them for. I haven't heard any, and that's the first that I've heard anyone actually push for it this year. Is that generally speaking, they try to say, the councilors ought to be making that decision ahead of the election.
And they should. They absolutely should. And I think when you go into the voting booth, whether I was a candidate or voter, I want to know where councilors I'm voting for stand on, or not voting for, stand on the tax rate, because it's going to affect my decision.
So that the election would also end up being something of a referendum on the tax issue, at least in part, because you would say, I know where, if I vote for this guy, I know.
Right. But shouldn't it be? It's one of the most important issues.
It's one of the most talked about issues whenever it comes up, but you're right, it doesn't come up before the election.
It certainly should. Of all the things we're talking about, it certainly should be on the list of things we're talking about.
Well, to your usual point, Mike, it's also one of the few powers the city council has. I mean, they legitimately do set the tax rate.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no arguing that.
That's a good point.
So.
Let's see how we're doing on time. Oh, we're doing good on time. I want to ask you a question. You're one of the older people who we've talked to for running for the city council this year. So I want to ask you this question, which is something that I worry about, especially in terms of is the city of Worcester economically sustainable? It's just is America economically sustainable? Have we entered a generation of economic decline? Have we entered a time of institutional failure? I don't know. To what extent? I don't know. This is something I worry about all the time.
It's a loaded question, but
it is a super loaded question.
I just turned 50, and I'm depressed enough. But 50, I guess, is the new 40. So,
well, I just turned 40, and this is probably why I'm obsessing about
this. You guys are the new 30. I'm not an economist, nor will I ever pretend to be. It's a very powerful question. I would say that we have a lot of challenges in the United States, and of course it passes through to the state and to the local level. A lot of people aren't working. Some of it is the economy. Some of it is maybe a change in generational mentality when people used to have a different work ethic. I'm a big believer that when there's more people on the cart than pulling the cart, you're in trouble. And in a lot of situations that's the case. But I also think that Americans in general are very optimistic people and hardworking people. And I think all the challenges we have, we've overcome them for the history of our country, and we'll continue to overcome them. But we have to remember, we started with somewhat of an advantage. There was a lot of third world countries, Asian countries that were way behind us. Now they're catching up and they're competing, and that's somewhat taking the edge off of our ability to be the king of the mountain. But I think we'll always be the king of the mountain in a lot of areas, and economically we'll reinvent ourselves to someday, some way we'll be back on top again.
There you go. Do the children in your life plan to live in the city when they grow up?
That's a tremendous question. That's one of the motivating reasons I'm running for city council. Okay. I hope so, but more than I hope so, I hope to have the opportunity to consider Worcester as a place to live. That's the first question. Are they going to be able to find a job in Worcester? Are they going to be comfortable with public schools in Worcester? Those are the two first key things. If we can answer that question yes, then I've considered Worcester and city government having achieved its goal, giving kids the opportunity to come back here. Whether they choose to come back here or not, ultimately it's going to be their decision. I hope my kids come back here. I love spending time with my kids, but I know they're only going to come back here if they have the opportunities that I just talked about.
Yeah. Do you have any questions?
No, I think that's
You don't have any questions about city council?
I'm terrible, aren't I?
Tracy.
I thought it was interesting you're asking about the government and its sustainability, though. We're doing that. You're asking that question in the middle of a federal government shutdown.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of these things. This is one of these things that just makes me. I don't know. Whenever you start obsessing about these kinds of things, all you see is evidence for it. I don't know whether that means it's actually evidence. I think it's just easy. You remember the newspaper headlines. I mean, we're not actually watching Hitler take over great swaths of
from perspective. It's true.
There have been terrible times in history before.
Oh, I'm not saying that.
So,
I'm not saying. I don't imagine some sort of Mad Max scenario for Worcester or America. I just guess. I mean, I'm just gonna say this as just a comment to answer my own loaded question. Sometimes I just wonder. I mean, we do see these big shifts in history. I mean, we saw this in the United States, where the United States goes from being this sort of weird second or third tier nation to being a superpower in a generation or a generation and a half. And why is it not? I don't know. And I feel we run things in this country with this mentality of we are a superpower, an economic superpower, which we are. But I don't know. To what extent is it helpful to be thinking about other scenarios and say okay, if we go into a generation of economic decline, and if the number of people in Worcester who are unemployed goes up, and if the money in Worcester stays the same, but the number of, it's one of these 99% 1% things, the people in Worcester who have money end up having a lot more money, and the people in Worcester who don't have money or don't have a job or are marginal. I think of all the college students, all the master's degree students and PhD students I know who are like working in coffee shops. If Worcester's coffee shop industry cannot expand enough to handle all these unemployed college kids,
See, but Moe's on
I don't know. This is why I like things. This is why I like things like this honestly, like different ideas like liberalization of zoning laws, because it sort of seems like, well, here's some like low-hanging fruit to like.
It's true. We've never addressed it. When I was on the zoning board, we'd make that argument. I particularly would make that argument over and over again. Why are we putting barriers in front of people who want to open businesses in Worcester? In the year 2013, it's not like 20, 30 years ago where the internet didn't exist and you had to be in a central location like Worcester because everybody had to find you. You can open a business in Leicester, Shrewsbury, or any of the suburban towns with internet access. You don't have to be in Worcester. So we have to encourage people business-wise to want to open businesses in Worcester, and we have to liberalize zoning. Another issue we may not get to is we have to make some major changes to our parking setup.
Okay.
We have some major problems with parking.
Tell me about this, because we get the time.
We don't have enough downtown. We don't have it standardized, so 1 meter could be 20 minutes, another meter could be 2 hours, all in front of the courthouse. I can tell you, somebody who is an attorney, I'm at the courthouse all the time. If I find a 20-minute meter, I can't leave and tell the judge, excuse me, my meter's going to expire. We want to encourage businesses to come downtown. It's the same problem. People don't want to come down for the limited businesses that are downtown if they're going to get a ticket. So we have to have enough parking spaces. We also have to modernize them so you can use a credit card. A lot of our meters don't allow for that. We also have to, I think, go back to a system which Worcester did very well and very progressively years and years ago, municipal parking lots. But the problem is we have to be able to run them either privately or publicly so we don't lose money. And I know some of the parking lots that are in existence today that Worcester owns lose money, and that's a challenge that we have to tackle. But nobody likes to go places where they don't have parking. It's an amenity that people like to have. People that go shopping out to the various malls, they like to have parking. They don't want to go to a shopping mall where they have to park in a garage or they have to drive around the block for half an hour to find a parking spot. We've got a lot of college kids moving downtown. Some of them are going to have cars. We've got limited parking to begin with, so we've got to plan for the future.
Very good, very good. I want to ask you a couple of ridiculous questions here.
Sure.
What do you carry with you on a daily basis?
Well, I carry my daily planner, my cell phone, and a pen.
Okay.
And I would say that's the basic.
You don't carry a knife?
No knife, no gun.
I was gonna say, are you using that as like a cutoff, like who you're gonna vote for city council? Like,
nobody's carrying anything. I don't know. Who were we talking to last week? Chris. I think we were
First of all,
talking
you gotta talk to more women because women have an built-in advantage. Because I can tell you about band-aids and like basically I could put you back together again.
This is
first
a good
aid
point.
kind of
I can tell you one thing I used to carry, I don't carry anymore.
What is that?
Now that we're on questions that you can give ridiculous
Yeah.
answers to. A comb.
Oh.
Me neither. I tell you, shaving my head was the best decision I ever made. You've seen The Wire, but you don't know. You haven't seen it for too long to know your favorite character.
I used to watch it, but to be honest, it's been a number of years, and I wouldn't want to confuse the characters. It was an entertaining program.
This show. You know why we asked this question?
Well,
I'll tell you why. Because I think it was the mayor of Reykjavik, a few election cycles ago in Iceland, capital of Iceland. This was when they were having a huge amount of turmoil over all this institutional corruption and their economy collapsing and banking scandals and whatever. And he sort of came in and he was like this comedian, performance artist guy, and his party was this sort of weird, goofy outsider party because people just hated the existing parties so much. And their party said, we will work with any politician from any opposing party, provided they've seen The Wire. And so we just trying to bring this concept to American politics.
I will definitely YouTube it, so the next time we see each other, I can tell you what my favorite character is. But it's been a while.
And on the question of most push-ups you've ever done.
Tell you the most sit-ups I've ever done was 60 and 60 seconds, and that was back in high school. The most push-ups I've ever done, I don't remember, but I can tell you I don't think it was as good as a sit-up, and I can tell you I can do either one of them as good now.
All right.
Okay.
So we haven't been talking a lot about horse race stuff on this show, and I don't like to talk about that because I feel like so much of the journalism around Worcester City Council races is 100% about, who's backing who has raised whatever amount of money. But there's one question I have to ask you about because multiple people have asked me about this. And I guess the background here is that every year I put up a blog post where I do a sort of very tongue-in-cheek analysis, semiotic analysis of all the yard signs in Worcester. Your yard sign this year, multiple people have emailed me and been like, what do you think? I need to read your blog post about it. Because your yard sign is like this Halloween type yard sign.
Well, it's orange and black.
And this seems sort of brilliant because the election is held around Halloween. And so as far as like grabbing colors and putting a color into consciousness, I mean, like Tracy has taken this school bus vibe. So every time you see a school bus, maybe part of you thinking it's Tracy. This fall, everybody's have their pumpkins out there, and everybody's going to be saying, well, there's another Moe Bergman supporter.
Well, there was a couple reasons for the signs. You're not off base, but I think the first reason, I went through Google different color combinations of other people who've run in the past, not necessarily for city council, but I want to do something different than the traditional red, white, and blue, something that would stand out. So John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson actually had an orange and black in '63 together. Now the color was a little more fluorescent orange. You can't get that anymore, but it was very close.
It was probably was radioactive or something.
It's illegal now.
So I liked it because everything popped, the colors popped, and then when I saw it, I thought about Halloween. I figured that since the race is going to be building up to Halloween and then decided shortly after Halloween, it'd be something catchy for people to remember. And I think those two reasons were the reasons we did it. They stand out and they're timely for the Halloween season. So I think it's a good color choice. Certainly it stands out as being something different.
It sure does.
And also we did a little bit on a slant to the name, which I think kind of accentuates the fact that it's a little bit different. But
I got to tip my hat to you. That's a great move.
Well, I appreciate it. Most importantly, though, I hope people don't assume that signs vote. People vote. and that's what we need, people to vote.
Unless Tracy has some questions, I want to ask a couple questions that people suggested to us on Facebook.
Ooh, you got suggested questions?
I do have suggested questions. Somebody actually asked a question about the idea of strong mayor. And so just to give people background who don't follow city politics, in Worcester, the executive is the city manager. The legislative body is the city council, and the city council also hires that executive and potentially fires that executive, gives a lot of guidance to that executive. So when you go to a city council meeting, there's tons of stuff where, like, if the city council needs to tell the commissioner of parks something, they always do it like through the city manager because that's the person that you work through. People are always talking about that we should go to a system in Worcester where we have a mayor who's the mayor, like the mayor in most places where the mayor runs the show. I used to think it was a good idea. I sort of think it's less of a good idea now. I'm never sure how reasonable it is, but I know that people have said that with the idea that our current city manager might leave at some point in the near future, maybe now's the moment to strike. Just curious to know this kind of city government question. Where are you?
I mean, it's a question that's been debated my whole adult life from other people that were involved in politics. And as I follow the question, I would say the system we have now works, and it could continue to work. I think making a decision in crisis mode is never a good decision. So if the city manager leaves, I don't think that would be the worst time to make that decision because it doesn't give you a good chance to reflect objectively. I also think one of the things that we could be mistaken of not having done is if Mike O'Brien does leave, I don't think we have an assistant city manager that's been there long enough to carry the load right away. And I think we need to have a farm team in all major positions because people do leave for their own personal reasons. So I think we have to have a good farm system. I also think that if there's any criticism of the current government, I think it's that the check and balance, the city council, I think, in a lot of ways, because of Mike O'Brien's hard work, and the fact that he's is involved, I think the city council, in some respects, which sets the agenda and lets the city manager do the day-to-day operations, those lines have been a little bit blurred. I think the city manager would have more time to do his day-to-day operations if the city council spent more time on policy. And I think sometimes the city manager now is involved in both because the city council has kind of let that situation develop. I don't think because of any malice. I just think that's the situation. So I think a better check and balance system would make the city government even work more efficiently than it does now. But I wouldn't be in favor at this point, and I don't see any reason that we need to have a strong mayor. I think a more interesting question that somebody may ask at some point is the history of why we have the system we have in Worcester, and it's not for the most noble reasons.
This is because we had a lot of corruption issues in the past,
Well,
right?
that's one explanation. The other explanation is around the time that the first Irish Catholic individual was elected mayor, the former heavyweights in city politics would have been the WASP, or White Anglo-Saxon Protestant community, started seeing the demographic changes and decided there had to be a way to have a city government where they could still have a role in running the city without having to worry about the demographic changes, which ultimately would mean they're unlikely to win elections as mayor.
Right.
So the system was set up so that there would be an alternative mayor, so to speak, who wouldn't necessarily be picked by the people.
Right, because that's always the city manager selection choice always seems, I don't know, it always seems, the last time I watched it just seemed very opaque and weird to me. Maybe I wasn't that much of a council watcher at the time to understand it, but it did seem like a confusing
But this is the same thing that we've talked about before with the city council. You've got to that that they're walking in there having lined up at least 6 votes. So somebody knows who's going to vote which way.
Right.
So that means that there have been conversations prior. The conversations aren't all happening on the floor. In fact, you might even say none of the conversations are happening on the floor.
This is another concern. Well, I'm glad to hear you talking about that. You would like to see the city council be a little bit more, I don't know, assertive on policy issues.
That's a good way to put it.
Because this is one of the reasons that I've been asking people, like, with all the things you can do in the city, why would you be on the city council? Because it oftentimes seems like the city council is mostly about being an advocate for people in city government, which is, getting their street repaired, getting this issue dealt with, which is an awesome thing to be doing. But I don't know, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily any more amazing or helpful than any of the other boards and commissions. But whereas actually passing city legislation, that maybe is potentially.
Well, I think if you take the approach that it should be taken as a city council, you're developing policy that you want to benefit individuals that live and reside in the city. I think it could be a very rewarding experience. But I think what we talked about is also true, that if you want to just defer those types of decision making to others, you're going to sit there for 2 years and you're probably not going to feel that you've accomplished very much. I'm going into it with the attitude that I want to make some changes and help develop some policy. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think that's the role I would play. I'm not going to be a water boy. I'm going to actually be involved. And if I were, I wouldn't be running.
Well, good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Tracy, thank you also.
Of course.
Again, if you have complaints or comments, you can email us at pieandcoffee@gmail.com. We'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.